Well, if you don't know already, Sarah is the vice president of, well, she's the executive director of the Indiana Medical History Museum and has been since 2014, but has been active at the museum in one form or another since 2007. She's the vice president of the League of Women Voters of Indianapolis and secretary of the Southern Association for the History of Medicine and Science. She also serves on the advisory boards of Easter Seals Crossroad at Central Indiana and the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies at IUPUI, the John Shaw Billings History of Medicine Society at IU School of Medicine, the Association of Indiana Museums, and Youth Enhancement and Training Institute, which is fondly known as YETI. So, Sarah, please take it away.
Thank you. Give me just a moment to share my screen here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about two early women physicians in particular who had their start and in one case, a career that spanned decades at Central State Hospital. But first, I'm going to share just a little bit of context, especially for anybody here today who's not already familiar with the hospital's history. So most people remember the hospital as Central State Hospital or just Central State, but it opened in 1848 as the Indiana Hospital for the Insane on what is now the near west side of Indianapolis. This was the first state mental hospital in Indiana, and though the name doesn't sound very progressive, it was in fact for its time. The hospital was established in line with the ideas of what's known as moral treatment. This widespread movement came in response to humanitarian efforts led by the Quakers and a very slowly emerging idea in medicine that mental diseases were just that. They were diseases that could be studied and treated, at least in theory, the way other diseases could be. That's also theoretical due to the state of medicine at the time. So this was an early effort to get away from the idea that people suffering with mental illnesses were just innately bad people, that they were being punished by God for moral failings, or worst of all, that they were beyond hope or unworthy of help. So this painting depicts a precursor to this movement. The man near the center with the funny hat and the cane, there's a woman kissing his hand. This is Dr. Philippe Pinel. The original of this 1876 painting still hangs, I believe, in the Salpêtrière in Paris, but this copy was presented to the pathological department at Central State upon its opening in 1896, and it still hangs there in that same spot in our library at the Indiana Medical History Museum today. And here's Pinel here circled in red. Pinel was a doctor during the French Revolution, and in this scene, he's liberating the women of the Salpêtrière Women's Asylum in Paris. This is shortly after the Reign of Terror ended. You can see that many of the women are chained to walls or otherwise restrained, and he argued that these women are not bad, they're afflicted, and that we can help them become productive citizens by trying to understand what's wrong with them and treating them like patients who are sick, rather than criminals who need to be confined in a prison. So the details of moral treatment will have to wait for another talk. It's a pretty broad topic, and that's not why we're here today. But this whole idea was pretty powerful. Just using the word hospital in Indiana Hospital for the Insane implied that the goal was to help people get better and not just lock them away. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing rather than mere confinement. Now, as it turns out, though this was a huge step in the right direction, it was largely ineffective. It provided more humane treatment and much improved living conditions for many patients. It certainly eased burdens on families, and it marked the beginning of a slow change in public perceptions about mental diseases and those who suffered from them. But with a complete lack of understanding of the nature of these diseases and no effective arsenal of therapies, doctors just couldn't do a whole lot. And there were a lot of other problems at the hospital too: inadequate funding, mismanagement, misappropriation of funds, nepotism, political cronyism, and a heartbreaking amount of abuse and neglect. So what you see here is the cover of the Indiana Crazy House, which was published in the 1880s by a former patient named Albert Thayer, and it offers a pretty scathing review of his time as a patient in the hospital and the horrors that he witnessed there. So that it really was a mixed bag. There were good intentions. For the most part, the doctors and administrators had good intentions and high hopes, but it just didn't pan out the way they thought. And during this period when the first female physicians are showing themselves at the hospital is a time of kind of calls for reform and a lot of change. This time leading up to this, all of these doctors and hospital administrators, for several decades of the hospital's existence, were exclusively white men. So it's hard to say exactly how many women were practicing medicine in Indiana in the early to mid 19th century. But for that matter, it's hard to say exactly how many men were. It's true that women couldn't attend very many medical schools. The first woman ever to earn a medical degree was Elizabeth Blackwell, who'd been admitted to a school in New York, mostly as a joke, and who graduated there in 1849. But until the late 19th century, many physicians in Indiana weren't trained that way. Most were trained through an apprenticeship rather than through formal education. Neither medical education nor the practice of medicine were regulated in Indiana for most of the 19th century. Medical licensing wasn't a thing. Medical professional organizations existed in the state by the middle of the century, but they weren't very large or particularly active until a bit later. So formal records of these individual doctors, whether they're male or female, and whatever their experiences, backgrounds, and training, they just don't give us a complete picture of the situation. So we don't know the numbers. Some historians have suggested that in the whole country in the mid 19th century, there were perhaps only a few hundred women practicing medicine. But that depends too on your definition of doctor. It's all very complicated, but it is fair to say that women physicians, regardless of education or training, were not a common sight in 19th century Indiana. And even in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, there were relatively few of them. There were two notable women doctors at Indiana Hospital for the Insane, whose stories I'm going to share with you today. And they are Dr. Stockton and Dr. Mary Spink, Dr. Sarah Stockton, excuse me. They were very different women in a lot of ways, but they shared a determination and a passion for medicine and a pretty strong sense of independence, and that made them pretty extraordinary in their time. But first, even though this talk is about women physicians at Central State, there's one male physician that I have to mention because of the role he played in the careers of both of these women, and that man is Dr. William Fletcher. So we'll start here. I mentioned before that there were a lot of problems that the hospital faced, and these problems by the 1880s were becoming more and more widely known and more widely reported in newspapers. These were allegations that Dr. Fletcher, as a prominent local physician and a state senator, was very familiar with, but he came to know them firsthand during his brief tenure as superintendent of the hospital from 1883 to 1888. In June of 1883, when Dr. Fletcher was appointed superintendent, he immediately began making changes, and some of them were pretty big changes in the hospital. He banned the use of alcohol as a sedative to keep patients subdued. He banned the use of physical restraints, except in cases where the patient posed a danger to themselves or others. Eventually, he blew the whistle on his own institution, launching a legislative investigation into those allegations of abuse and neglect, mismanagement, unqualified staff, and the poor quality of food and building materials, all of those things. And these allegations were found to be true to varying degrees. He began a recreational therapy program for chronic patients. He lobbied the state government to change laws related to how female patients were conveyed to the hospital. He stopped the city's streetcars from bringing large groups of people out to the hospital grounds to gawk at and harass the patients. That was something that had been instituted in the name of transparency so that the public could see where their tax dollars were going, but it quickly became a popular form of entertainment at the expense of the patients. And then Dr. Fletcher also started a literacy program on the grounds so that patients could learn to read and write. So he did a lot of great things. I could go on and on. But before all of this, one of the first things that Dr. Fletcher did was hire the hospital's first ever woman physician. This was something he had pushed for as a state senator, and now he was in a position to finally make it happen. He felt that female patients would benefit from having female doctors, and that sounds like a great idea. But on the other hand, he and nearly every other physician at the time, male and female, felt that a lot of mental illness in women was caused or made worse by irregularities, deformities, and dysfunction of their sexual organs. He wrote, quote, "It may not be that a large number of women would recover under special treatment, but it would be a comfort to every parent, brother, and sister to know that their afflicted loved ones who are insane from the fact of being a woman were to fall into the hands of a cultured and refined female physician when shut behind the hospital bars. Since it was inappropriate for a man to make a thorough examination of a woman's nether regions, it also made good sense to bring in well-trained women physicians who could make a proper examination and who knew what to look for." The quote I read gives you the sense that he didn't have high hopes for recovery for these women, but he didn't mean that he didn't believe a woman could be as good a doctor as a man. That woman physician at Indiana Hospital for the Insane, hired by Dr. Fletcher in 1883, was Dr. Sarah Stockton, originally of Lafayette. This is cropped. It's not a great quality here. I apologize for that, but this is the only known photograph of Sarah Stockton. And it doesn't look quite as bad. Usually I've done something terribly wrong here with PowerPoint. But a lot of the detail and a lot of the personal perspective is missing from Dr. Stockton's life story, and especially her childhood and young adulthood. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how often the voices of women are left out of the historical record because most had no real legal existence until they were married. Even then, they were often only present in formal records or in relation to their husband or other family. Dr. Stockton later turns up in the newspapers after she becomes a physician and she's launching her career. But coverage of her is usually very brief. It's almost always pertaining to her work. And this is very different than the coverage we see of the other physician that I want to introduce you to today, who was a generation younger and in some ways led a much more public life. Sarah Stockton was born on a farm near Lafayette in 1842. After their parents died, Sarah and her sister Mary took over management of the Stockton House Hotel and Boarding House in Lafayette. In 1879, they sold the hotel and Sarah moved to Philadelphia to attend medical school. And I wish I knew more about why she made that decision, but we just don't have records to shed light on that. But she enrolled at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which is now part of Drexel University, and she graduated in 1883. And here she is on the commencement list. This was the subject of her thesis was insanity. And this is her handwritten 7-page long thesis. This always makes me laugh to think that that's all it took to graduate from medical school. But it covers the history, causes, and treatments of insanity. After receiving her medical degree, Dr. Stockton returned to Indiana and settled in Indianapolis to begin her own practice, which she continued even after being recruited by Dr. Fletcher at the Indiana Hospital for the Insane. Dr. Stockton did sometimes clash with some of the other male doctors, but she was also well liked by some and by many of the patients. Later in life, she was described by some in kind of less friendly terms, somewhat crotchety maybe. But that was not a universal sentiment, and it tended to be people who had some kind of beef with her. For example, after her death, her family didn't appreciate how she distributed her money and property in her will and tried to paint her as combative and unreasonable because she didn't leave her property to her male relatives. In his 1884 report to the governor, Dr. Fletcher praised Dr. Stockton and congratulated himself on the wisdom of his decision to hire her. He wrote, quote, "I'm pleased to report special improved condition of the female patients under her charge. She has had to take charge of one division of the Department of Women as a general practitioner and do all of the special work for the whole establishment and has given complete satisfaction in every capacity." One patient, Anna Agnew, in a memoir she wrote of her experiences soon after she was discharged in the hospital in 1885. So this is roughly the same time that Albert Thayer wrote his very negative view of the hospital. Anna Agnew wrote in her memoir, "I don't think my sisters of the Women's Rights Party will care to claim me as one of them." But she did see value in having a woman physician at the hospital. She also wrote, "I do with all my soul sanction her education as a physician, and for the sake of and on behalf of suffering women, insane women in particular, since they cannot tell their misery, I make an appeal to the Board of Trustees of every female hospital for the insane in the land for the appointment of a woman upon their medical staff." She wrote of Dr. Stockton specifically, and this quote is a little bit rambling, so I apologize for that. She wrote, quote, "I felt the first time she came into my darkened room where I lay in such agony as only miserable women suffer, and seating herself at my bedside, looking pityingly at me, the expression in her lovely blue eyes in itself a mute promise of assistance, before a word was spoken, that an angel had been with me." And she wrote of the hopefulness her words inspired, and more than once referred to Dr. Stockton as my dear friend. At the time of her appointment at the hospital, Dr. Stockton was just one of 22 physicians in 18 state hospitals in 9 states. And those numbers we do know, they're quite low, but not shockingly or surprisingly low. But Dr. Stockton's tenure at Indianapolis for the insane, or Indiana Hospital for the Insane, at least her first stint was only slightly longer than Dr. Fletcher's. So I mentioned that he had launched this legislative investigation. Dr. Fletcher became unpopular with the Board of Trustees and several in state government when the findings of this investigation into problems at the hospital revealed how corrupt many of them were. The position of superintendent was an appointed position, so it's no surprise that in 1888 he was forced out and returned to private practice. He opened a brand new private sanitarium on the other side of town. Soon after, in 1889, Dr. Stockton was discharged by the incoming superintendent, Dr. T.S. Galbraith, who had previously clashed with both Fletcher and Stockton and who resented Dr. Stockton in particular. She had asked that her testimony in the investigation be kept private because she feared for her job, and she really didn't have much that was nice to say about Dr. Galbraith, and he wasted little time dismissing her once he was promoted. So Dr. Stockton then followed Dr. Fletcher to his new sanatorium. But she stayed there just a short time before being recruited to head the medical department of the Indiana Women's Prison in 1891. In fact, she was the only physician on staff there for both the Indiana Women's Prison and the Indiana Reform School for Girls. So she was responsible for delivering all medical care and for performing needed surgeries for the entire inmate population. This is kind of the larger photograph that I had cropped before. In 1999, Dr. Stockton returned to Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane. It had changed its name by that time, where she spent the rest of her career, eventually becoming a senior physician there. She also served on the Indiana State Board of Charities and Correction from 1904 to 1907. So this photo of her and other doctors at the hospital was taken in the library at what is now the Indiana Medical History Museum shortly after she returned for her second stint. During her career, Dr. Stockton delivered several talks to groups, including the Indianapolis Women's Club and the Indiana Women's School League, on topics like the value of Red Cross influence and work for humanity and poverty as the mother of crime. She was a delegate to the State Medical Society, elected by the Marion County Medical Society, and she was pretty well known in the community. In 1922, Dr. Stockton fell and broke her right hip while she was working at the hospital. The injury slowed her down, but she didn't let it stop her from continuing her work, which is unfortunate because this led to another fall soon after in which she broke her left hip. She never recovered from these injuries, and for the last 2 years of her life, she was basically an invalid. And she'd also developed some heart troubles by this time. And on March 13th, 1924, 25 years after returning to Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane, she passed away after a severe heart attack. In accordance with her will, her body was taken to St. Louis and cremated at the Missouri Cemetery. And her sister, Miss Mary Stockton, had also been cremated when she passed away back in 1895. That cremation was interesting enough that it held a prominent place in several newspaper articles about Mary's death. And the Logansport reporter noted that she was the first person ever to be cremated from Lafayette. So Sarah held on to Mary's ashes, and then the two intended to have a kind of a reunion of sorts after Sarah's death. So when Dr. Fletcher left Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane, Dr. Stockton followed him there, but so did another woman physician. During his career, Dr. Fletcher encouraged several women to enter medical school. And one of those women was a nurse at the hospital, Mary Spink. By the time Fletcher left, Mary Spink had become Dr. Mary Spink, and her career at Dr. Fletcher's sanatorium was pretty impressive even for a male physician of her day. Mary Spink was born in Washington, Indiana, down in Daviess County on November 18th, 1863. Her father, Urban Spink, was a real estate agent. Her mother was Rosanna Morgan Spink. She moved to Indianapolis as a very young woman. There are contradictory accounts of her early education and her early days in Indianapolis, but she may have worked at some point as an attendant at City Hospital, which is now Eskenazi. And she was working as a nurse at Indiana Hospital for the Insane when she decided to become a doctor. She was discouraged by some of her family, but Dr. William Fletcher encouraged her in this pursuit. In 1887, she was among 3 women in the graduating class of Indiana Medical College. There were 32 male students that year. These 3 women were the first women graduates of the school, which after a later merger became what is now IU School of Medicine. Her career was exceptional, but even in med school, her abilities made her stand out. Before she even graduated, she began doing some pathological work at the hospital, and this is before the pathological department was established. It wasn't in our building. And at her graduation, she was awarded the Taylor Anatomical Prize for her excellent dissection work. After graduation, she did complete postgraduate studies in nervous and mental diseases in New York City. And in 1888, when Dr. Fletcher was removed, she went with him to establish Dr. Fletcher's Sanatorium. And there she specialized in psychiatry and neurology, but also treated patients for general medical needs. Dr. Fletcher's sanatorium became quite popular, and in 1903 it expanded. The new building was renamed Neuronhurst after the newly discovered neuron. And the building was also jointly owned by Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Mary Spink. So they both had equal shares in the hospital. One of Mary's sisters, Urbana, had by this time become a doctor as well, graduating from a medical school in Philadelphia. And she was working closely with the other 2 to run this facility. Dr. Fletcher bragged that the new building would be, quote, superior to any institution in the state and as far as is known to any sanatorium in the United States. He was considered by many to be a leading psychiatrist in the city, and the sanitarium flourished. For Dr. Mary Spink and Dr. Fletcher, this was a far cry from Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane, where financial troubles, serious allegations, and other problems made their work very difficult. The rooms at Neuronhurst were comfortable with wide verandas. They had easy access to the sun and air. Neuronhurst had a completely equipped gymnasium and swimming pool, a state-of-the-art laboratory for diagnostic testing and research, which Central had by this time as well, with the pathological department opening in 1896. But the Neuronhurst had an operating room, gardens, a steam-heated solarium, lounge rooms, music and social activities were provided. Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Spink, both Dr. Spink, closely supervised the patient's care, offering personal attention, cutting-edge treatment, scientifically supervised diets, and minimum use of restraint. Patients received all manner of therapeutic baths from specially trained staff, and advertisements from Neuronhurst like this one. These had a broad reach well outside of Indiana and as far away as New York City, but these bragged that all appliances known to medical and surgical science were available on site. They even ran a training school for psychiatric nurses at the sanatorium that accommodated 30 students. And all of this hard work was done by the doctors jointly as partners. A few years before his death, Dr. Fletcher began spending winters in Florida. His health had been slowly declining, and Dr. Spink had begun taking more and more of the responsibility for running the institution and the nursing school as well, with help from her sister. In 1905, Dr. Fletcher suffered a stroke, which he would never recover from, and he died in Florida in 1907 at the age of 69. By this time, Doctors Mary and Urbana Spink had been running the sanatorium essentially on their own with an almost entirely female staff for a number of years already. And upon Dr. Fletcher's death, Dr. Spink, Mary Spink, officially became president of Nernhurst and full owner. In his will, Dr. Fletcher left his share of the business to her. And then Dr. Urbana Spink became vice president and secretary. Dr. Spink was very well known and pretty well liked in the community. She was becoming wealthier. This sanatorium was no state hospital. The lovely atmosphere, the high-tech equipment, the constant attention, all of this came at a pretty steep cost to the patients, many of whom were wealthy themselves. And Dr. Spink became involved in a number of high-profile civic clubs and causes. Her personal life and activities were quite unusual and interesting as well, which is why she's frequently in the newspapers. And coverage of her is, more often personal than Sarah Stockton experienced. She was a member of local and state medical societies and the American Medical Association. She was a close family friend of Vice President Charles Fairbanks and visited the family in Washington. She was a member of the Indiana State Board of Charities. She was frequently featured in society pages of the newspapers. She and Urbana were among a group of women physicians who in 1909 established the gay chapter of the New Sigma medical fraternity, later the Women Physicians Republicans Club. She traveled abroad and hosted parties on the ground in Nernhurst, like graduation parties for the medical school and a garden party that she held for her fellow suffragists in June of 1912. This party was held for members of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana and the Equal Suffrage Association of Indiana following the annual business meeting of the latter. Newspapers described a parade headed by Dr. Hannah Grant as president of that association, and this parade started at the Board of Trade building where the meeting took place and made its way to Nernhurst where they had this after party. And the newspaper called it the first suffrage parade in the streets of Indianapolis. In 1927, while at Lake Wawasee in northern Indiana, where her brother Edgar had built the Hotel Wawasee, which was later the Spink Hotel, according to newspaper accounts, she became a princess of the Blackfeet Nation when 33 chiefs, squaws, and children of 2 nearby tribes danced and performed other tribal ceremonies. I include this only because it's so fascinating to me. I have yet to find any reasonable explanation as to how this came about or why this happened. So I think it's really intriguing. And here's a group photo in front of the hotel where this ceremony of sorts took place. Her 1927 trip to Siam was hot news in town for quite a while. It's one of my favorite stories about her. I think it's really neat that not only that she went, but that she went alone. She went to visit another of her sisters and her sister's husband, who was an advisor on foreign affairs to the King of Siam at the time. So Mary spent 3 months there sightseeing, attending fancy parties, becoming friends with the Princess of Siam, all of this fun stuff. A number of other women physicians in Indianapolis had gone to Asia to do mission work, but Mary Spink's trip seems to have been entirely personal in nature. She took her first airplane ride while she was there in a small wooden plane with just her and the Siamese pilot. And she talked later about how she had to prod him to take her higher because he was being too cautious. And while in Siam, she decided she ought to build a vacation home there and arranged for the purchase of a stretch of beach on the coast of the South China Sea. The area was called Tiger Valley, and she began making plans to build what she called a bungalow, but what elsewhere was described as a mansion. And when she left Siam, she gave her brother-in-law $500 to purchase this land for her. And she hadn't even gotten all the way back to the United States yet when she received an envelope from him containing $497.50 and a note telling her that the land was hers for $2.50. Urbana had followed Mary to Indianapolis, but her brother Edgar Spink of the E.G. Spink Company also did well for himself there, which benefited Mary and then Urbana later as well. He built several large apartment buildings in town, including the Spink Arms Hotel and the Murat, which are both on Meridian Street. And when he died in 1929, Mary Spink became president and general manager of the buildings he operated. And then after her death, they went to Urbana. But Dr. Spink lived a pretty full life. Like Dr. Stockton, she never married, and we don't know the reasons for this, but I do imagine their lives and careers might have looked very different had they married. Dr. Spink stayed incredibly active into her old age, both professionally and personally, and she continued to run the sanatorium until just a few years before her death in 1939. For the last 4 years of her life, she spent a lot of time at another home she owned in Fort Myers, Florida. But more and more, Dr. Urbana Spink, and this is Urbana and their mother. She really had been handling most of the work running Nernhurst. In 1928, the year after Mary returned from her trip to Siam, Urbana Spink and their mother left for their own trip around the world and ended up in Siam as well. They had their own Siamese adventure, but they did stop in Italy in the Vatican City so that they could meet with the Pope. And this is from a newspaper article upon their return. Dr. Spink still saw some patients, regulars who she'd been treating for years, but she didn't take on new patients. Though she wasn't as active as a physician, she was still very active in other affairs until she became sick a little over a month before her death. At that time, she flew to the home of her sister and brother-in-law, Raymond Stevens. This is the same sister and brother-in-law that she had visited 10 years previously in Siam. They had moved to Lisbon, New Hampshire by this time. She returned there, and that's where she passed away, surrounded by family members in the late summer of 1939. And Nernhurst, which had thrived under her leadership for many decades, closed shortly after. It probably had little or nothing to do with Dr. Urbana Spink's ability to handle its day-to-day operation. The business had actually been declining as the Great Depression depleted its pool of wealthy clients. And so both Dr. Stockton and Dr. Spink were active in their roles at the Indiana Hospital for the Insane and beyond. Neither meekly accepted the status quo, and both had a meaningful impact on the institution and the patients they treated there. The hospital always had problems, and those continued all the way up to the time of its closure in 1994. Throughout its long and complicated history, there were doctors and nurses and attendants who took advantage of their positions, mistreated patients, or looked the other way. But there were so many more who passionately worked for and in the best interests of their patients and who made a real positive difference. And I think Dr. Spink and Dr. Stockton are both certainly remembered among the latter.